It's a pleasure to see all of you here at the Washington Court Hotel. As Tom said, we went to a larger venue to accommodate the growing interest in our annual meeting. And it's my pleasure to moderate this first session on the crisis in U.S. Russian nuclear arms control. We're going to be focusing here on the crisis facing primarily the INF Treaty and the future of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction before we hear some opening remarks from each of our distinguished panelists and then get into a discussion about these issues. As many of you already know, in February, following the failure of talks to resolve mutual concerns about the INF Treaty, Washington and Moscow suspended their obligations under the INF Treaty. So barring a diplomatic miracle between now and August 2nd, the U.S. is on course to withdraw from that landmark 1987 treaty, which led to the verifiable elimination of some 2,692 nuclear-armed intermediate-range missiles in Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The collapse of the INF Treaty, from our perspective at the Arms Control Association, opens the door to renewed missile competition. And we'll be talking a bit about what we can do to avoid that. Russia conceivably could deploy more of its controversial 9M729 ground-launched cruise missiles. Russia could also convert some of its sea-based cruise missiles, the Caliber system, for ground launch. For its part, the Trump administration wants to begin testing before the end of this year a new ground-launched intermediate-range cruise missile. And even Ukraine, a party to the INF Treaty, let's not forget, has suggested it might pursue INF missile deployment. Meanwhile, the New START Treaty, which verifiably caps both the U.S. and Russian deployed strategic arsenals, will expire on February 5, 2021, unless the two presidents agree to extend the treaty or somehow negotiate a replacement. So without the INF Treaty and without a positive decision to extend New START, there would be no legally binding limits on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals for the first time since 1972. Now, last year, President Putin voiced interest in an extension of New START, and the Trump administration announced it's pursuing a whole-of-government review about whether to extend the treaty. And that review, of course, is being led by John Bolton, who publicly called on President Trump to terminate the New START Treaty shortly before he was named as National Security Advisor. So with that introduction, I want to introduce our three excellent panelists to discuss how the U.S. and Russia can navigate these stormy waters. First, we have here in the middle, of course, Richard Burt, a veteran of U.S.-Soviet arms control negotiations with the Reagan and Bush administrations, and he was the leading negotiator for the 1991 START I agreement. And he's currently chairman of the organization Global Zero, among other things. Joan Rohlfing, on the right side, is president and chief operating officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, with whom we've partnered for many years since NTI was founded back in 2001 by Senator Sam Nunn and Ted Turner. And of course we're very honored to have Anatoly Antonov, who is Russia's ambassador to the United States. As his bio and the other bios in the program show, he has a long and distinguished career in the diplomatic sector with the Russian Foreign Ministry, including serving as chief negotiator for the New START agreement. And I've asked each of them to give us some brief opening remarks of some 5 to 7 minutes on what they see as the value of U.S.-Russian arms control towards risk reduction efforts and the U.S.-Russian dialogue on strategic issues. I've also asked them to offer their thoughts about what can be done in the wake of the likely termination of the INF Treaty to head off a new INF missile race, and what they see as the value of the New START agreement and the way forward. So 3 very simple questions with some complicated answers. And then after we hear from them, I'll engage our panel in a discussion about some of the deeper issues. This is not an introductory discussion on these issues. This is a well-informed crowd, so we'll be getting into some details about the way forward. So With that, I want to welcome Ambassador Burt to the stage. It's an honor to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daryl, and I can't help but recall that when I was still kind of writing about these issues for the New York Times in the late 1970s, I was invited to talk to an annual meeting of the Arms Control Association then. Mm-hmm. So that was 40 years ago. So we haven't yet succeeded, folks. So there's a lot to do. I would begin by kind of talking about what I consider to be the great paradox about the status of U.S. Russian arms control at present, because I would argue that rarely, if ever, has the issue faced. Has the issue been more problematic, and as this conference correctly diagnoses it, we confront a crisis. And I'll go into a little more detail in just a moment on that, but it's a crisis that is a political crisis, it's a technical crisis, and it's a crisis that raises real questions about the future stability of the nuclear relationship itself. But the paradox is this issue gets so little discussion, at least here in the United States. It is a back pages issue. If you want to read about arms control, you go to the weather page of the Washington Post, and maybe there's an article about it. So, I mean, it is just striking, if you will, the lack of attention this issue is getting when juxtaposed to the problems we are confronting. So I'm going to make three basic points. The first is the arms control relationship, in my judgment, cannot go forward. We're not going to succeed as long as the U.S. Russian political relationship is so damaged and is continually worsening. It's hard to think of a relationship, even at some of the worst moments of the Cold War, where the U.S. and Russia are at odds on more issues. And I don't need to give you the laundry list of whether it's on regional issues like Ukraine, Syria, now Venezuela, basic political questions that had to do with the perceived intervention of Russia in our domestic affairs. And that has led to an even worse development, which is Russia policy has become a domestic political issue in our politics, which makes it, in my view, almost impossible to solve because people want to use it for their own domestic political purposes. And that's what you've seen. And you will continue to see it as we move towards the 2020 election. So we've got a major political obstacle. Secondly, we've got technical obstacles. It isn't just that the United States has stepped out of the INF Treaty. That's bad enough. In my view, the Russians hoped that we would at some point step out of the INF Treaty. Vladimir Putin himself was complaining about the INF Treaty, I think 10 years ago. So I think the Russian side didn't like it anymore. The United States basically doesn't like arms control, at least doesn't like the constraints of arms control, as Daryl pointed out in the case of John Bolton. So there was a kind of convenience. Both sides had real reasons to step out of this treaty. The likelihood of extending the START treaty, in my judgment, is pretty low. I think that while I think Russia would like us to continue to adhere to it, I think that there are real questions of whether this administration will continue to do so. So there is that problem. But even if we stay in the treaty, the real broader problem is can any future U.S. Congress support future arms control agreements? And given the polarization of our politics, is it possible to get arms control agreements ratified any longer. That's a longer-term issue that's worth thinking about. But beyond the simple treaties and the politics of those treaties, there is the technological issues. And I guess I'll very quickly make the argument that I think we're beginning in doctrinal terms, actually in thinking about the role and purpose of nuclear weapons, to diverge with the Russians. I think the Russians still support the notion of mutual assured destruction. And I believe that is one reason why Vladimir Putin was so unhappy about our abrogation of the ABM Treaty. I think that the United States is beginning to think, at least some people in our government are beginning to think of moving beyond assured destruction, and with new technologies, particularly in the areas of strategic defense, whether it's boost phase intercept, the use of directed energy weapons, and regional ABM systems, that we are thinking once again, as happened for a period of time in the 1980s, about shifting to an actually defensive dominant nuclear strategy. That, in my view, is that divergence between an offensive focus on the Russian side, a defensive on the American side, is potentially highly destabilizing and needs to be addressed beyond simply getting new arms control agreements, but in having a deep, deep discussion about the function of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, a real discussion of strategic stability. I'll end on this note and by saying we also need to think and be probably more creative than we've been before about how new arms control agreements might look. Maybe they should be more informal. Maybe they should really resemble confidence building measures. Maybe the era of numerical constraints and defined launchers and warheads, maybe that is no longer possible. Maybe we need to think about approaches which give decision makers more time to make decisions in the event of a crisis. Maybe that means redeploying systems. I think that if arms control is going to survive in this new and very difficult political environment, we're going to have to be much more thoughtful about what kinds of approaches might work.
Thank you very much for the sobering thoughts, Rick. I want to turn now to Ambassador Antonov, who's thought and worked for many years on these issues. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a possibility to participate in this event. Ambassador Burt has raised some issues, and of course I have a lot to answer. But if I start,
You got to turn up your thing. Is it turned on?
Yeah,
you said that
I think it's,
I can stay over there if you
no,
want.
I think you're fine if you just.
Well, they were, okay.
It's
All right.
Ambassador has prepared 3 points. I have prepared 10. But all of them not just only for you, but for those folks who are watching us, because I'm sure that not everybody understands what we are talking about and why this issue is so serious. I agree with you when you have mentioned that we have just only a little discussion in Washington on the situation regarding strategic stability, arms control, non-proliferation. For me, for example, there is no opportunity to come to Congress and to explain your senators, your legislators, how we understand the situation. It's also very important to speak directly, looking in your eyes, but not to speak just only through mass media. But at this stage, I spent already 1.5 years and I failed to start such a dialogue. That's why I highly appreciate this possibility to discuss with this issue. Immediately, I would like to react what you mentioned. Maybe we have to revisit our conservative approach to legally binding documents on nuclear disarmament or maybe in strategic stability. We are looking very attentively what is going on in the United States. We don't want the same situation that we face now with JCPOA. after a change in administration, you see that there is a decision to cancel this agreement, not agreement, arrangement, or I don't know how to call it, maybe understanding. So we would like, that's why we would like you to understand why we want legally binding document. We would like this document to be ratified by your Congress. It should be the law for the United States and for the Russian Federation. So my first point, I assume that the majority in this room favors arms control. I assume. We are concerned by the current shape of strategic stability. Why do we need arms control? My understanding is simple. Arms control, including disarmament, creates a favorable and predictable atmosphere between major powers, positively impacts the international situation, eases tensions in the world, saves taxpayer money that could rather be invested into our economies and therefore benefit our people. Why does the majority in the world pressure the Russian Federation and the United States on arms control? I'll try to answer. The Russian Federation and the United States are the major nuclear powers, possessing 90–95% of all nuclear weapons. That's why in 2009 our leaders decided to start negotiations to limit American and Russian strategic offensive arms. It was a logical step, taking into account our positive experience of bilateral cooperation on strategic stability. The potential for joint efforts for peace, security, disarmament, strengthening non-proliferation and arms control is far from being exhausted. We can do so much more if we respect the national interest of each other. The primary goal for us is to build a security architecture which would give tangible results of the principle of equal and indivisible security for every nation. Second point, the Russian security is not solely determined by the balance of strategic nuclear weapons of our two countries. It depends on many other factors, including the plans to develop the United States Global Missile Defense System, long-range high-precision systems, the United States non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, balance of conventional forces, existence of a large number of military bases with a growing military infrastructure near the Russian borders, proposed deployment of weapons in outer space, a perspective of the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, the situation with non-proliferation, and etc. Third point, for many years, the United States has been rejecting any limitations on its military capabilities. Today, we are planning to discuss the INF and New START treaties and what should be done to limit painful consequences of efforts to destroy arms control regime. But these treaties are just a part of global problem. Fourth, the issue of including every nuclear state in the process of limiting and reducing nuclear weapons is becoming increasingly pressing. Fifth, let's take a look at what has been done by the Russian Federation to preserve the INF Treaty. Since 2007, we have been making suggestions to make the treaty multilateral. That's exactly what the United States administration is proposing now. We have been discussing our concerns over Washington's compliance with the treaty with an INF Special Verification Commission without making them public. In order to dispel United States complaints over the 9M729 missile, we were ready for unprecedented transparency measures, which reached far beyond the INF obligations. What did we get in return from our United States partners? Our suggestions were rejected. Our concerns over unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, Target missiles and Mk-41 launchers deployed as a part of the United States missile defense in Europe were simply ignored. Washington decided to take a hard-edged stance and talk to us through ultimatum. It goes without saying that such an constructive approach is absolutely unacceptable to us and cannot lead to a positive outcome. Due to the end of the INF Treaty, the level of predictability of international security and strategic stability will certainly decline. A risk of misinterpretation will increase. 6, and just its reaction what Ambassador has just mentioned. Recently, political scientists and mass media outlets have been vigorously imposing the idea of so-called Russian and American withdrawal from INF Treaty. Such statement is a harsh distortion of the real facts and completely fails interpretation of the stance which our country has taken in response to Washington's decision to completely dismantle the treaty. It would be absolutely incorrect to talk about Russia's withdrawal from the treaty. We have never been pushing this agenda. We have never been pushing this agenda. We were consistently trying to preserve the INF Treaty. Only after Washington suspended its obligations under the treaty, our country, considering the United States violations of the treaty, was forced to take a reciprocal action. However, we haven't taken any step on actual so-called withdrawal, including sending a corresponding notification. Therefore, it would be wrong to push us on the same line with the United States in this regard, both from conceptual and legal points of view. 7th, on February 2, 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin made it clear Russia will not deploy intermediate range or shorter range weapons if we develop weapons of this kind, neither in Europe nor anywhere until United States weapons of this kind are deployed to the corresponding regions of the world. 8th, it was United States withdrawal from the ABM Treaty that forced Russia to develop entirely different new arms. Now some politicians and generals have expressed grave concerns over these systems. Yet we have been warning about possible consequences of Washington's unilateral actions. We have kept saying that we won't stand idly by watching strategic stability being distorted. Nobody believes us. And what do we see now? Astronomical sums of money will be spent to develop global missile defense, but all analysts admit that our new strategic weapons can penetrate any missile defense system. Further increase in spending money to pursue this goal will only harm American taxpayers. Meanwhile, our response is outlined in a way that will not draw the Russian Federation into a costly arms race. By the way, according to the 2018 NATO Secretary General's annual report, NATO states spent almost $1 trillion on defense. Therefore, alliance defense budget was at least 20 times bigger than Russia's defense spending. You can decide for yourself who is pushing the world towards an arms race. 9th, concerns are growing over the future of the New START, which expires in 2021. On many occasions, we voiced our readiness to extend the treaty for another 5 years. We are told that the issue is being considered on interagency level. The extension of the New START is not a simple technicality that could be resolved in a couple of weeks. Serious issues must be settled. We hope that Russian concern regarding conversion procedures the United States has employed to meet the accord's limit will be fully dispelled. We have to remember that American side has reached the set limits not only by actually reducing the arms, but also by converting a certain number of them in a way that Russian Federation still cannot confirm their incapability for employing nuclear weapons as it is specified by the treaty. And the last point, 10th, as a leading nuclear power, we responsibly adhere to our arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation obligations. Our proposals to resolve the INF issues and preserve the New START still stand. The efforts required to return to equal professional dialogue are not exhausted. We won't act needy. We will not initiate talk on these matters in the future. It's a position was introduced by my president. We will wait for our partners to come around and engage in an equal and meaningful dialogue on this issue of global importance. Are new shocks really required for this to happen? I hope not. All our proposals are on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that review of the Russian view on these issues. We'll get into some of the details in a little bit, but first, Joan Rohlfing from the Nuclear Threat Initiative, your thoughts.
Thank you, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be here today, honor to be on the panel with these two esteemed colleagues, and wonderful to see all of you, all the expertise in this room. These are the people who go to the weather page to read about this issue on a regular basis.
And arms control today.
And of course, arms control today.
It's better than weather.
As Mo Udall once said, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So I'm going to try and recap on a few of the things that the previous speakers have already said. I've got a simple three-point message and then a few embellishments, but the 3 points are, number one, we're in an extremely dangerous moment. Number two, we're moving in the wrong direction. And number three, we need a new strategy for pulling back out of this dangerous escalatory cycle. Let me talk about these things further. What would a new strategy for pulling back from this dangerous escalatory cycle look like? I think it's clear we need to find a way to stop arguing about how the ox cart got into the ditch, as Sam Nunn would say, and instead start talking about how to get the ox cart out of the ditch. We've been now through year upon year upon year of accusing each other, raising concerns, talking past each other, and all the while escalating. And I would say, you know, I've been asked recently to speak a number of times on the question of, are we in a new arms race, or is a new arms race preventable, as if we're on the verge of one but haven't yet entered into one. And I would say it's clear that we're in a new arms race, maybe not even so new, and that we've been in one for some period of time. We need to move beyond the mistaken idea of the U.S. in a unilateralist world, or as Ambassador Burt said, a world where we shift to a defense-dominant doctrine. We can't spend our way to nuclear safety. We are locked in mutual vulnerability for the foreseeable future. So more lethal forms of these weapons, more numbers of these weapons are not going to make us safer. They're simply going to introduce new risks. So how do we get out of them, and what role does arms control play? I think Ambassador Burt said it well when he talked about the value of arms control, and so did Ambassador Antonov. I want to just add to that. I always go back to a classic from 1960, the Tom Schelling, Morton Halperin book called Strategy and Arms Control. And the case he makes is that arms control is another way of achieving military strategy, another path to achieving, another means of achieving military strategy. Arms control can help us reduce the chances of war. It can reduce the consequences of war if it breaks out, and it can reduce the costs to both parties in the interim. I think that's a good bet, and we need to get back to these basic principles of why arms control is so important. So what do we need to do in that space? I would say our number one priority by far, and there's a great sense of urgency about this, is let's please at least preserve the last remaining guardrail we have, and that is, of course, New START. And I believe New START should be extended without conditions. I worry that both the US and Russia are overplaying their hands by trying to leverage, in the case of the US, bringing new systems into the mix, or trying to bring a new party under the treaty. And on the Russian side by saying, well, we've got to resolve these concerns first before we can extend New START. I think that leaves us in a very perilous position where potentially New START is either allowed to expire, or worse yet, we decide to withdraw from it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's like canceling your homeowner's insurance policy while you try to negotiate a better deal, and meanwhile the house burns down. So let's at least keep the safety net in place to buy ourselves the space and time that we need to resolve the legitimate issues and concerns of both sides. And then let me just conclude by making a final point, which is something, Daryl, I hope we can focus on in the Q&A, and that is the importance of the US and Russia. We're now about a year out from the 2020 NPT review conference, which is an important moment in time. This is the backbone treaty preventing proliferation around the world, and it's under extreme stress as a result of the lack of progress on arms control, particularly between the United States and Russia over the last 5-year period. The US and Russia need to think about what it can bring to the 2020 review conference. I would say an extension of the New START treaty is a bare minimum, and I think we need to look forward and think about what else can both sides bring. Can we commit to further reductions? Can we commit to begin negotiations for a successor treaty? Can we call on other nuclear armed states to commit to a freeze or a ceiling on their numbers while we figure out how to all move down closer toward zero? So let me stop at that.
Thank you very much, Joan, and I thank you for your forward-looking suggestions. I do want to have our conversation that we'll have now to be forward-looking, looking at how we solve these problems rather than going back over past disagreements. And so let me start with, I got some questions I wanted to get into the discussion before we open up the questions to the audience in a little bit. And I wanted to start with a question about New START and an issue that Joan raised and a question that Ambassador Antonov raised. Last week marked the 9th anniversary of the signing of New START. It was the 8th, actually, and on the occasion of that anniversary, a group of 24 senators led by Chris Van Hollen, who we'll hear from at our reception today, wrote to President Trump urging him to extend New START with Russia for another 5 years. They said failure to extend New START risks unraveling a broader arms control regime that has helped uphold stable deterrence and curb a costly destabilizing arms race for nearly half a century, themes that each of you have touched upon today. I mean, I think one of the things that's important about this letter is that, to me, it speaks to the fact that despite the political differences between the U.S. and Russia, and despite the fact, as you said, Ambassador Burt, that U.S.-Russian relations have become something of a political football, there still is a strong reservoir of support in the Senate for maintaining a dialogue and maintaining the guardrails with Russia on nuclear issues. But as Joan brought up, there is the possibility that some of the issues that we heard about from Ambassador Antonov and some other issues that we heard from Secretary of State Pompeo last week could become impediments in the way of a political decision on New START. So I wanted to ask each of you, and Joan, you can have another whack at this if you wish. I mean, if we all agree that New START extension is a bare minimum step forward, it's clearly just a part of the larger puzzle, but it's an important part. You know, how should the two sides move forward? Must the issues regarding Russia's concerns about the verification of the conversion of U.S. strategic systems become something of a condition that has to be resolved before a political decision is made on extension? Should concerns that the United States government may have, we're not sure if they're real, about covering the new Russian strategic systems within New START become a precondition? Or should the two presidents make the political decision to move ahead with extension well ahead of the 2020 review conference and agree to resolve these issues in the years ahead? So that's my basic question. I think that was the proposition that Joan was putting forward. Ambassador Burt, if you could offer your thoughts first, and then we'll let Ambassador Antonov offer his reactions, and Joan, if you have any additional thoughts. Rick?
Well, I just think we should keep it simple, stupid. And I think the fewer constraints or revisions or clarifications that either side requires in order to extend this treaty, the better. And I think that both sides should agree that if they've got these problems and questions, that they will get first priority in any follow-on discussions. But both because of the NPT, but more importantly, in order to show both sides, but let's be honest here, particularly the U.S. side, that there is some new momentum in the relationship. I think this should be a position that the Russians should adopt. And I would hope, look, I'm quite sure that John Bolton for the American side is looking for opportunities and ways to turn an extension discussion into a new negotiation, and to use the talk about our strategic modernization program and everything else that's going on as bargaining chips in order to get a better deal in an extended agreement. Well, we should drop that. But the Russian side should also recognize that this is an opportunity to perhaps transform the U.S.-Russia relationship. Does it want to continue to live with an America that's obsessed with the idea that the Russians are intervening in American domestic politics, that the relationship is driven by these differences on regional issues? Or is there an opportunity, as was the case in the 70s and into the 80s, to make the arms control issue a pivot point for improving the whole overall relationship as a whole? I hope both sides do that.
Thank you. Ambassador Antonov, your thoughts?
It's rather difficult to react. First, you said that I prefer to react to what you have mentioned, but Ambassador Burt today already has mentioned twice Russian interference in internal relations. You said that, first of all, it's not an issue of our discussion. I spent here 1.5 years. I didn't make any remarks on this issue. But it seems to me that you're sending me a message to make a reaction on this issue. I would like to say to everybody, we are totally rejected all accusation on this issue, and again, it's not an issue for our discussion today. First. The second, you said it, START Treaty. It seems to me that we have to stick to all provisions of START Treaty. We have concluded this agreement not just only to show the international world that we are continuing negotiations between major nuclear weapon states. We tried to show our readiness to reduce a quantity of missiles and warheads that we possess. But I hope that you understand that we have to implement all provisions of that treaty. And if we see some issues, I don't want to call them impediments, I would like to say again that some issues that have to be discussed together, we have to discuss it not inviting mass media, but to discuss them in the format of BCC, special bilateral commission established to solve all outstanding issues in the context of START treaty. What we are talking about conversion of United States, we are talking about questions regarding procedures used by United States regarding conversion of their arsenal. We would like to get an answer. We would like to see disarmament to be irreversible. So what we want, we would like to solve all these outstanding issues. As to speak about the new nuclear weapons that Mr. Putin has presented recently, I just would like to say you that it's not a subject of this treaty. We have made it clear that we are ready to discuss them in the format of strategic stability talks. But it's not Russian Federation, it's the United States who is not ready to restart such talks. So, first of all, I would like to support everybody who is in favor to consider extension of this treaty as it is now, without amendments. And I understand that if we decide to expand a subject of this treaty, it means new negotiations. It will be another treaty. So that's why, first of all, we have to sit together with our American friends. We have to tackle all outstanding issues, and we have to decide whether this treaty is still in the favor of the United States interest as well as the Russian interest. My president has made it clear that we are ready for such discussions.
Thank you. Just for the sake of clarity, if I could ask you to just answer a particular question about the new Russian strategic systems. As I understand it, there is the Sarmat heavy missile, which is an ICBM, which would logically be covered under New START if extended. There is the Avangard hypersonic vehicle, which is launched from an ICBM, correct? That would be covered through the delivery system limits under New START. The question is probably about the Status 6, also called the Poseidon nuclear-armed underwater torpedo. So that, I think, is the system that you're suggesting, tell me if I'm wrong, that would have to be discussed with the U.S. as to whether it's covered. Is that correct?
First, you see that in accordance with provisions of this treaty, each side has a right to raise any issue that this side would like to get an answer. And I understand that we have some confidential discussions on various issues of strategic offensive arms. I hope that you understand that I don't want to disclose details such confidential talks. But again, if we decide to cover all these nuclear weapons that was presented by Mr. Putin, it will be another round of negotiations with a view to amend some provisions of this treaty. It means negotiations. For me, it means that the result of this negotiation must be ratified by Congress and by State Duma in the end. It couldn't be just only political binding agreements between this administration and the Russian Federation. So that's why you see that I'm in favor of simple decision, just only to find a solution on all Russian concerns regarding United States implementation of this treaty and to extend this treaty as it is now. Provided that we are ready, I would like to confirm again, to continue or restart our consultations on various issues of strategic stability. That's why, if you remember, in the beginning of my remarks, I raised some points that we would like to discuss with our American friends. You said that in the format of strategic talks between the United States and Russian Federation.
Thank you. I'll get to you, Rick, but let's let Joan have her
I just wanted to pick up
crack
on
at
a
this.
couple of the comments that were made. First, with respect to Russian concerns about some of the conversions, I would just say, your 10th point, Mr. Ambassador, was about Russia adhering to its arms control obligations. And I would hope that, that being the case, that Russia would in fact use the BCC to resolve these issues, but in the meantime would agree to extend New START without any conditions, on the assumption that we will be able to work through those issues through the BCC. I also wanted to pick up on the observation that Ambassador Burt made about extending New START as an opportunity to build political momentum with the U.S. and to use it to transform the relationship. I think that's a really fundamental point, and if we can't find some way to get out of this ditch that we're in, it's going to be really tough to do anything in the arms control space. Arms control could unlock this. Congress also can play a role here. I think Russia can help the U.S. and itself, but Congress needs to play a role in creating a space for dialogue between the administration and Russia, and I would hope that Congress would step up and begin some active outreach on a Russia strategy, both with the administration and perhaps even with interlocutors on the Russian side. And the final observation, just to echo what Ambassador Antonov was just saying, those who are calling for bringing new kinds of weapons into the extension process or adding new parties like China are really talking about a new treaty.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It's disingenuous, right? If you're talking about opening up and a renegotiation, that's a new treaty. That's not a simple executive extension that you start.
Yep.
You said I have to react. You said it because
You
I
don't
would like
have to, but you could. If we could just add, Rick, do you want to go back to something before, and then I'll give you a chance, Ambassador.
I wanted to make two quick points. One thing is probably historians probably know about, but most people don't, is Ronald Reagan ran against the famous SALT II treaty that was never ratified but between the two countries because of events in Afghanistan. What was interesting was, though, the Reagan administration actually lived up to the terms of SALT II throughout its 8 years in government and told the Soviet side it was doing so. So to argue that, well, we've got to have treaties that are ratified by the Senate, this is the future of arms control, actually that isn't what happened in the 1980s into really the early 90s when the START Treaty was finally signed and ratified. So it is possible for both sides to exercise restraint. And if the politics, for one reason or another, it seems to me, either in Russia or the United States, don't enable an administration or a government to announce that it's publicly going to sign an agreement or agree formally to an extension, I can live with some unilateral restraint exercised by both parties, because that's, after all, what we're trying to achieve.
Mr. Ambassador?
Yes, you said it, dear colleagues, I just would like to make some clarifications. Today you have already mentioned twice that Russia has introduced conditions for extension. Please, we didn't introduce any conditions for extension. I would like to repeat it again. We never made it in such way. We never put it in such way. I said that we have concerns, and these concerns have to be tackled in the format of BCC. That's all what I said. I didn't say that somebody is violating treaty and so on. please, I would like to be very cautious. Regarding, again, we return back to the issue, what kind of agreements we need in the future. Of course, there are different school of thoughts on this issue. It could be unilateral statements. It should be political binding documents. As to me, I am very much conservative. I am in favor of legally binding documents. Frankly, my distinguished colleagues, I don't understand what is going on sometimes in the international scene. So you see that after the Second World War, it was clear that we have a legal, international law, legal system, which was endorsed by the United States, by the Russian Federation, the majority of the world. Now, you see that all leaders from West have decided to forget about international law. That now everybody is talking about order based on rules. Order based on rules. I don't understand what does it mean. If you look at all statements made recently by politicians in Europe as well as in the United States, you will see that there is a decision to change international law for order based on rules. So what does it mean? You see that as to me, I have grave concerns regarding this expression. And again, you see that I would like to see our peace, our world more stable. If there is a general understanding, what does it mean? It means that all politicians in your country as well as in my countries have to be involved. It goes without saying that I am in favor of participation of your Congress in this process. And I have to say that I would like to welcome a letter on behalf of 23 senators sent to administration regarding the necessity to restart a dialogue between the United States and Russia, and it's high time for us. It's high time for us to decide what we will see in 2021. And of course, you see that it's also very important to think about the future NPT review conference. I know how it will be difficult for the United States as well as for Russian Federation, for all P5 to make a report to non-nuclear weapon states regarding implementation of Article 6 in this regard. It will be very difficult, but I don't want everybody to treat Russia as they will treat the United States during this conference, because it was not our intention to withdraw from INF. It was not Russian intention to forget about START treaty.
Well, let's turn to the INF Treaty briefly, and I want to talk about what we do now to get the INF Treaty situation out of the ditch, so to speak, to use Joan's imagery. So, as I said in my opening, it is possible that in the coming 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 years, we could see the United States and Russia deploying intermediate range ground-launched cruise missiles that are currently prohibited by the INF Treaty in Europe, perhaps the United States, in areas in Asia. And so I wanted to ask each of you to briefly tell us what your thoughts are about whether and how the two sides might reach an agreement, whether legally binding or politically binding, that mitigates against that risk. And specifically, I mean, Mr. Ambassador Antonov, you mentioned President Putin's proposal from February 2nd, I think it was, and President Putin said, we proceed from the premise that Russia will not deploy intermediate range or shorter range weapons.
Point 7 of my remarks.
Oh, I'm sorry. If we develop weapons of this kind, neither in Europe nor anywhere else until the U.S. weapons of this kind are deployed to the corresponding regions of the world. So let me start with Joan, and then Rick, and then Ambassador Antonov. I mean, what could the two sides do at this stage, given the lack of dialogue on the INF issue, to mitigate against that risk, and how could President Putin's idea be developed into a more solid and meaningful proposal.
Thank you. I've been given a second microphone. Hopefully this is better than the last one. I want to start by picking up on the last comment that Ambassador Antonov made, that it was not Russia's intention to withdraw from the INF. Fair enough, but I do think we need to note here that we are at this moment in time, in part because of a Russian violation of the treaty, testing and now deploying a system that exceeded the prohibitions of the INF Treaty. But looking forward, how do we get out of this ditch? I think it's unlikely that we're somehow going to rescue the INF Treaty at this point. I think it's clear we need to move to a prohibition on deployment on a regional basis of the treaty-limited systems. That's what we should be working on.
All right. Ambassador Burt, your thoughts?
So I think, first of all, if we're going to somehow try to rescue INF, we have to realize everything is in the U.S. Russia relationship is connected with everything else. So it's not going to happen, even if we're very bright and committed, if a New START extension runs off the tracks, or there's a blow up in the relationship, say over something like Venezuela. So we have to realize that this is a very, very fragile relationship. Now, the best kind of, I guess, model for me about what you do with a explosive issue of cheating is you go back and look at the experience that took place under the ABM Treaty with the famous Krasnoyarsk radar. And that issue took almost 2 years of intensive discussion and negotiation to resolve. Why? Because both sides wanted to save the ABM Treaty. And so you had a lot of information exchange, you had a lot of disagreements, and different positions were offered, and finally there were changes made to the radar and how it was deployed in a way that met the needs of the U.S. side, and the ABM Treaty survived. I don't think both sides have gone the extra mile here to resolve this issue. It's not enough for the Russians to bring some weird-looking device and put it in a hall in Moscow and ask reporters to come and take photographs of it. There should have been an open agreement that, on the one hand, American inspectors and experts were able to actually visit the test range and look at the data and look at that system and determine whether or not this system was in violation. And at the same time, Russians should have been invited to the Aegis Ashore facility in Romania. They should have taken a look at that launcher, and they should have discussed the kind of software or other changes that were necessary to make sure that offensive weapons couldn't have been used in those launch tubes. And they should have, both sides should have been open to make the necessary changes to stay in compliance. But I go back to what I said earlier. I think for the U.S. side, you had people who didn't want to be constrained by this agreement and somehow saw this agreement as limiting our options vis-a-vis the growth of Chinese military capabilities in East Asia. I happen to think that having ground-launched cruise missiles in Asia for the U.S. is a nutty idea, but still, that was what was driving the U.S. side. And on the Russian side, hey, I understand the Russian perception. They happen to be ringed by countries that have countries with nuclear weapons. So they probably, I think, for over a decade or so, have wanted to leave that agreement. So unless both sides are willing to walk the extra mile and take those kinds of steps, that treaty, as far as I'm concerned, is a goner.
Right, Ambassador, unless you're going to make a new proposal that will save the INF Treaty, I wanted to just encourage you to look forwards and tell us a little bit more about President Putin's proposal, what it means. We've got serious arms control wonks in the room. I mean, I think they might be interested in understanding better, to the extent you can tell us, what systems that covers, which ones it doesn't cover. Does it cover the 9M729 or not? What is the geographic area that President Putin is thinking about? How do we define that? And then how do the two sides reach some understanding? I mean, what's the mechanism? So I just want to give you a chance to elaborate a little.
It's a little difficult for me just only to cover this issue within a few minutes. First, you said that, let's be frank, let's be candid. We shouldn't pretend saying that is just only one reason why the United States has decided to withdraw from INF. It was made clear 1.5 years ago when admirals, United States admirals, made it clear that United States had concerns regarding China. It was clear, and at that time I already made it clear to Moscow that Washington is planning to withdraw from INF first. Then there was a necessity for United States to find a pretext to withdraw from INF. And this pretext is excellent, that Russia is violating INF. I just would like to flag a problem that you have mentioned 1 sec before. You said that Russia has tested prohibited missile. I don't know about it. Could anybody give me facts that Russia has tested missile beyond the limits of INF? Even United States administration didn't say so. But if you didn't test this missile, it's impossible to say that this missile or that missile could fly more than 500 kilometers. We have to be very cautious regarding our arguments. Our problem with the United States is that we have a different perception what is going on in the framework of INF. United States is sure that Russia has violated norms. We have tried to explain that we are in compliance with INF. Moreover, you have just only repeated what you heard from administration, but you have no any fact that there is a violation of INF by Russian side. But at the same time, we have presented a lot of documents and factual documents that the United States is not in compliance with INF. By the way, I have requested my colleagues from my embassy to present you some documents that it's outside of this conference, where you will take Russian arguments on INF, on strategic stability, and on START treaty. Don't forget when you leave this building to take Russian propaganda. You see that? So, third point, what does it mean? You have raised the question. If we look at President Putin's statement on 2nd of February, it's very easy. We are looking very attentively what United States is doing. We will take into account all United States efforts. We will not be the first who will undermine what we have today. And we will answer in a way that United States does. That's all. As to proposals to United States to solve this issue, if you again look at a statement made by Mr. President, my president, you will see that President Putin has made it clear that all our proposals are on the table. We are ready to deal with them. We are ready to discuss them. But we will not initiate more conversation, talks on this issue with the United States. We will wait. If and when United States is ready to restart substantial conversation with the Russian Federation. You said that you have criticized Russian proposals on INF. It could be not enough to meet concerns of the United States. It could not assuage concerns by the United States. But there is just only one demand from United States. You must eliminate missile 9M729. That's all. You see that we are permanent members of Security Council. We are nuclear power. It's not possible to speak to each other in such tone, using just only ultimatum and just only to demand from one side to do something without putting on the table from your side. So we are in favor of a respectful conversation between two major nuclear powers. We are ready and we are waiting reaction from the United States to all our proposals.
I want to thank you all for the respectful dialogue, and I want to now just invite the audience to offer their questions for our panelists so that we can stay on time. And I want to just alert my staff to have the handheld microphones ready. I see Ambassador Jim Goodby, who's been working on this issue for longer than most of us have been alive, to offer the first question, and doing a damn good job at it, too. Ambassador Goodby, and then I would invite also other members of the press to offer their questions. Jim? And the microphone, please.
I wanted to first commend the speakers. I thought it was an excellent panel. There was one thing that was left out, however, and I'd like to ask you to fill that in, if you don't mind. A few days ago, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal written by George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, and it offered three rather specific proposals for trying to get out of the ditch that we're in. One was that there should be a congressional panel established to work with the administration on trying to change our policy towards Russia. Second, there was an idea that had to do with a statement that Russian and American leaders have made before, to the effect that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The suggestion was that Putin and Trump should issue a statement that would include a statement like that, and I would think that would be a useful thing to do, and seems compatible with what I've heard Ambassador Antonov say just now. And third, there was the notion that we really need to have a serious discussion between Russia and the United States at the professional level regarding our vision, mutual vision, for a stable future over the next 5 to 10 years, is what was mentioned, because of all the unstable developments are occurring at the present time. So what do you think of those particular proposals, which I thought might be useful and might be useful to discuss here? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Joan, I suppose you think those were all great ideas, right? Yes?
I endorse them.
You endorse them. Good. Perhaps I can, Ambassador Burt, Ambassador Antonov, you can react.
And I endorse them as well, and I admire and respect the three authors. I would say, though, that and I know that the Nuclear Threat Initiative, as well as the European Leadership Network, which I'm involved with, has been pushing this idea of the statement that Reagan and Gorbachev made, and I think that would be important, and I think it would resonate worldwide. I don't think the idea, frankly, of the idea of kind of putting together a congressional group. I saw the value of that when I was negotiating the START agreement. It was fantastic to have people like Sam Nunn, people like John Kerry, really titans of the Senate come to Geneva and actually sit down and get briefed and spend time with the Russian negotiators and really building a base of support for what we are trying to do. But I have to tell you quite honestly that our politics today are so polarized and so broken. I really wonder if you could put a group like that together. It's worth trying, I think, but I don't think it needs to be done as if possible in a balanced way. And also we have to I think, bear in mind another point about the U.S. Congress. I won't filibuster here, even though they do that, at least in the Senate. But I think, though, just as is true within our governments, and I say not just the U.S. government, but the Russian government as well, is also true for the Congress. There's not much expertise in this area anymore. If you look around and think about the people who have real experience in negotiating these issues and real experience in understanding these issues, there is a big generation gap. There isn't the muscle memory there once was. So if we were to gin up a big U.S. Russia negotiation, it'd be hard to find people in our bureaucracy. And it's also, I have to say, the Russian bureaucracy. When I go to Moscow and am asked to participate on a panel, I'm sitting there with guys that are as old as I am, and that's too old. So both in terms of the Congress and in terms of our government, if we're going to address these issues, we need to get a whole new generation of young people engaged and involved in this.
Indeed. Ambassador Antonov, if you could be quick because we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you.
I have to be very cautious because I'm your guest. I don't want to be involved with any discussions in your country, whether it is in the interest of the United States to restart dialogue or not. But of course, I am in favor of any constructive proposal in this sphere. It goes without saying. I share your concerns regarding a lack of expertise in the Russian society. But you see that you can understand how it's possible to see new generation if there is no any dialogue between the United States and Russia. I remember when we started our negotiations on START treaty, the situation was the same. We looked around where those guys who know everything about arms control. There was nobody, just only you and your counterparts in Russian Federation. And it was a lot of concerns in Russia whether we, Russian delegation, would be ready to tackle all issues with distinguished American team. But in the end, we understand that everything is possible. And there was my proposal to my counterpart, Rose Gottemuller, to continue our negotiations and not to leave Geneva. We like it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're going to have to close out this session so that we can stay on track for our other excellent panels. I want to thank each of our panelists for a great discussion, Ambassador Antonov, Ambassador Burt, Joan Rohlfing. And I want to close with a thought from a former U.S. Russian arms control negotiator who recently passed away, because I think at this moment, after this discussion, we could use a little bit of encouragement. That former negotiator, of course, was Larry Weiler, who recently passed away. Larry was 98. He was a regular attendee at the Arms Control Association annual meetings. He was very active and concerned about these issues into his final year, and last year spoke at the State Department anniversary. I think you were there too, Mr. Ambassador, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the treaty. He and I co-wrote an op-ed urging the U.S. and Russia to get back into discussions on these issues. And so Larry had a bit of experience going back to the Eisenhower administration on these issues. And he wrote in a message to Arms Control Association members last summer, he said, "Though we've achieved progress, our work is not done. The disarmament regime that many inside and outside of government have helped to build is at risk, but I'm still optimistic. Even in the dark days of the Cold War, we persisted. American and Soviet negotiators engaged with one another in an effort to reduce nuclear risks. If we could do it then, we can also find practical ways to tackle today's tough challenges." So I hope this gives us some ideas about how we can do that. I hope we'll continue trying. Thanks everyone for your attention, and we're going to take a 2-minute break as we make the transition to the next panel.